Sir, if you sign that contract, you won't own your company by next week. The sentence sliced through the boardroom so sharply that even the projector's soft humming seemed to stop. Every head turned at once. Nathaniel Brooks slowly lifted his eyes from the contract in front of him, disbelief spreading across his face like a storm cloud rolling over glass. For half a second, nobody moved. Then laughter broke across the polished mahogany table. Low at first, then louder. A few executives exchanged amused glances while one investor leaned back in his leather chair and muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Standing near the digital presentation screen was Alina Carter, the youngest assistant on the 32nd floor of Brooks Capital. 29 years old. Black blazer slightly wrinkled from a 14-hour shift. Tablet pressed tightly against her chest. The silver assistant badge clipped to her waist suddenly felt heavier than concrete. Nathaniel gave a slow smile, cold and effortless. Did the assistant just interrupt a $40 million acquisition? More laughter. Someone near the end of the table quietly pulled out a phone, already recording. Alina felt the heat rise into her cheeks, but her posture never changed. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, Manhattan glowed beneath sheets of cold November rain. Taxi headlights slid across wet streets 32 floors below like streaks of molten gold. Inside the room, the air smelled faintly of espresso, printer ink, and expensive cologne. Nathaniel tapped his Montblanc pen against the contract. "Tell me something," he said calmly. "Which part of your job description suddenly made you think you belonged in this conversation?" The room fell quieter now, not because anyone respected her, but because humiliation was entertainment when the victim couldn't fight back. Alina swallowed once. "Page 47, she said softly. "Appendix C." Nathaniel's smile widened. "You memorized page numbers too? That's adorable." A few people chuckled again, but Alina didn't look at them. Her eyes stayed on the contract lying open in front of him. The debt trigger clause transfers temporary voting authority. After the first financial default, she continued. But the wording doesn't define the duration. Legally, they can hold controlling interest permanently. One of the attorneys frowned slightly. Another adjusted his glasses and reached for the document. Nathaniel leaned back slowly, amused more than threatened. "You expect me to believe my legal team missed that?" Alina hesitated just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. "I think they missed the footnote attached to subsection 8. The attorney flipping pages suddenly stopped. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Alina saw it immediately. So did Nathaniel. The older man's smile faded by half an inch. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the city skyline. Inside the boardroom, nobody laughed anymore. The attorney's face drained of color as his eyes moved across the page again. Then once more. Nathaniel straightened slightly in his chair. "What is it?" he asked. The attorney didn't answer right away. His fingers tightened around the edge of the contract. Across the table, someone whispered, "Wait, what?" Alina finally exhaled slowly, though her heartbeat still hammered against her ribs hard enough to hurt. She knew this feeling. The moment before powerful people realized the invisible person in the room had been paying attention the entire time. The silence inside the boardroom felt heavier than the rain pressing against the skyscraper windows. Nathaniel Brooks slowly leaned forward, his expression no longer amused. The attorney beside him adjusted the contract under the soft white conference lights, reading the same paragraph for a third time as though the words might suddenly change if he stared hard enough. They did not. Across the polished table, investors exchanged uneasy glances. The confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier was beginning to crack like thin ice under pressure. Alina Carter remained standing near the digital screen, shoulders straight, tablet still held tightly against her chest. She could feel every eye on her now, but this attention felt different. Before, they looked at her like background noise. Now they were trying to understand how someone they barely noticed had seen what an entire legal department had missed. Nathaniel's voice finally broke the silence. "Explain it." The command came low and controlled, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. Alina stepped carefully toward the table. Her low heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each sound echoing through the room. "The acquisition appears standard on the surface," she said calmly. "But subsection 8 references an external compliance trigger tied to debt restructuring." One investor frowned. "And?" Alina turned the contract toward him. The wording allows temporary oversight during financial instability, but the footnote attached underneath removes the time limitation. The older investor's face tightened slightly as he read, meaning, Alina inhaled once, meaning once voting control changes hands, there is no legal obligation for it to be returned. Another silence followed, longer this time. Outside, lightning flashed somewhere beyond the Hudson River, briefly illuminating the glass walls of the boardroom in cold silver light. Nathaniel stared down at the page, jaw tight enough to show the tension beneath his skin. That is impossible, one executive muttered under his breath. Alina looked toward him carefully. No, sir. It is intentional. The words landed hard. Across the room, someone quietly closed a laptop. Another executive loosened his tie as though the temperature had suddenly changed. Nathaniel's attorney cleared his throat. She is correct. The sentence hit the room like a dropped weight. Nobody moved. Nathaniel slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the table with precise control. For the first time since Alina had spoken, uncertainty crossed his face. Small, fleeting, but real. He turned toward the lead negotiator sitting across from him, a silver-haired investor named Richard Holloway. Did your team know about this clause? Richard raised both hands slightly. Nathaniel, these agreements are complicated. That language is standard in some international deals. Do not insult me, Nathaniel replied quietly. The calmness in his voice felt far more dangerous than anger. Richard looked away. Alina could feel the tension tightening across the room like invisible wire. The city lights outside blurred against the rain-streaked windows while the giant digital screen behind her continued displaying revenue projections no one cared about anymore. Nathaniel slowly looked back at Alina. His eyes studied her differently now, not as an assistant, not as someone invisible, but as a problem he did not fully understand. Where exactly did you learn to read contracts like this? He asked. A few people shifted in their seats immediately, curiosity replacing arrogance. Alina hesitated for only a second. I used to work in financial risk analysis, she answered softly. Nathaniel's brows narrowed. Used to? Alina lowered her eyes briefly. Before my mother got sick. The room remained silent. Somewhere down the hallway outside the conference room, a printer hummed faintly. Inside, nobody laughed anymore. The rain outside intensified, streaking across the towering glass windows in restless waves while the boardroom remained trapped in a silence no one seemed willing to break. Nathaniel Brooks slowly stood from his chair, the movement controlled but tense, like a man trying to keep pressure from cracking through concrete. His dark tailored suit looked almost sharp enough to cut through the cold white light hanging above the conference table. Across from him, Richard Holloway avoided eye contact completely now, his fingers nervously adjusting the silver cufflinks on his sleeve. The confidence that usually filled billion-dollar negotiations had drained from the room, replaced by something heavier. Embarrassment, fear, uncertainty. Alina Carter remained near the edge of the table, her breathing calm even though her pulse still hammered beneath her ribs. She had spent years teaching herself how to stay composed in rooms where people stopped seeing her the moment they noticed her badge. Assistant, temporary staff, support personnel. Those labels always came first. Her intelligence came second, if it came at all. Nathaniel picked up the contract again, scanning the paragraph with narrowed eyes. How many people reviewed this? He asked quietly without looking up. One attorney cleared his throat. 5 members of legal and 2 external consultants. Nathaniel let out a humorless laugh under his breath. 7 professionals missed what my assistant caught in under 10 minutes. Nobody answered. A faint vibration from someone's phone buzzed against the conference table, startling the room before quickly falling silent again. Alina looked toward the rain-covered skyline outside. From 32 floors up, Manhattan looked strangely distant tonight, softened beneath fog and flashing lights. Somewhere down below, sirens echoed through wet streets while yellow cabs crawled through traffic like slow-moving embers in the storm. Up here, the air felt frozen. Nathaniel finally turned toward her fully. You said you worked in financial risk analysis. Yes, sir. Where? Alina hesitated briefly. Grant Mercer Consulting. Chicago. One of the older investors looked up immediately. Grant Mercer? His surprise slipped out before he could hide it. That firm handled international banking compliance. Alina nodded once. I worked there for 4 years. Another silence spread across the room, but this one felt different. The executives were no longer looking at her with amusement. Now they were recalculating everything they thought they understood. Nathaniel's eyes sharpened slightly. Why would someone with that background work as an assistant? The question hung in the air carefully, balanced somewhere between curiosity and disbelief. Alina lowered her gaze for a moment before answering. My mother needed dialysis 3 times a week after her stroke. I moved to New York to take care of her. Her voice remained steady, but softer now. When she passed away last year, I had already been out of the industry too long. Nobody wanted to hire someone with a gap in their resume. The room stayed quiet. One executive slowly removed his glasses, suddenly unable to meet her eyes. Nathaniel looked down at the contract again, but his expression had changed. The arrogance was still there, buried deep beneath years of power and habit, yet something else had entered the room beside it. Regret. Small. Uncomfortable. Real. Richard Holloway finally spoke, forcing a weak smile back onto his face. Well, fortunately this was caught before signatures finalized. Nathaniel's head turned slowly toward him. Fortunately, his voice dropped lower. If she stayed silent for another 60 seconds, you would have owned controlling interest in my company. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The massive digital clock on the wall quietly shifted to 8:47 p.m. The meeting had already run 2 hours over schedule, yet nobody moved toward the exit. Because everyone in that room understood something now that they had not understood an hour earlier. The most dangerous person in the building had not been sitting at the head of the table. She had been standing quietly against the wall the entire time. The tension inside the boardroom no longer felt like a business meeting. It felt like a reckoning slowly unfolding beneath cold white lights and rain-covered windows. Nathaniel Brooks stood motionless at the head of the conference table, one hand resting against the polished wood while the unsigned contract remained open in front of him like evidence in a courtroom. Nobody touched their coffee anymore. The drinks had gone cold nearly an hour ago. Thin steam long vanished into the stale air. Richard Holloway shifted in his seat again, forcing another practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. Nathaniel, perhaps we should table this discussion until legal can revise the language. Nathaniel looked at him slowly. Revise, he repeated quietly. You tried to bury permanent control of my company inside a footnote. Richard lifted his hand slightly. That interpretation is aggressive. No, Alina said calmly from the far side of the table. It is accurate. Every eye turned toward her again. Nathaniel noticed something then that he had completely missed earlier in the evening. She never raised her voice. Not once. Even now, surrounded by executives worth hundreds of millions of dollars, she spoke with the steady calm of someone who trusted facts more than power. Richard gave a short laugh under his breath. And now the assistant is leading negotiations? The comment landed with a familiar sharpness, the kind polished men used when they wanted to remind someone exactly where they belonged. A few executives looked down immediately, uncomfortable. Others remained silent, unwilling to challenge the man who controlled half the investment capital sitting in the room. Alina lowered her eyes briefly toward the contract before answering. No, sir. I am simply reading what your lawyers wrote. The silence that followed hit harder than any argument could have. Nathaniel looked away for a moment, jaw tightening as though he suddenly realized how many times he himself had spoken to her the exact same way. Like furniture. Useful, replaceable, invisible. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over Manhattan again, shaking the distant skyline behind sheets of rain. The massive digital screen on the wall continued glowing with acquisition projections and growth forecasts that now felt meaningless compared to the tension hanging across the table. Nathaniel finally spoke. Everyone except legal stays seated. Chairs shifted softly around the room. Nobody argued. The lead attorney adjusted his tie nervously while another legal consultant reopened the appendix with trembling fingers. Alina stepped back toward the wall near the presentation screen, instinctively returning to the place where assistants usually disappeared once executives took over. But before she could fully retreat into silence again, Nathaniel stopped her. Miss Carter. She looked up. His voice remained calm, though quieter now. Stay. The single word changed the room instantly. Several executives exchanged glances. Richard Holloway's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Alina hesitated for only a second before nodding once. Nathaniel walked slowly around the table, stopping beside the panoramic window overlooking the city below. From this height, New York looked endless. Thousands of tiny lights flickered through the storm like distant stars trapped beneath rain clouds. He folded his arms tightly across his chest. "Do you know what happens if this deal goes through tonight?" he asked without turning around. Alina answered carefully. "Your board loses majority control within 18 months. And after that," she inhaled softly, "your investors answer to him." Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. The room stayed completely still. Somewhere down the hallway, the elevator bell chimed faintly before disappearing again into silence. When Nathaniel finally turned back toward the table, something inside him had shifted. The arrogance remained, built from decades of wealth and power, but it no longer filled the room alone. Because for the first time in years, Nathaniel Brooks had been forced to confront a truth powerful men hated most. The person they overlooked had become the smartest voice in the room. The boardroom remained frozen beneath the soft white glow of recessed ceiling lights, while rain continued sliding down the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after Nathaniel Brooks admitted the truth hanging over the room. The realization sat heavily across the polished conference table like smoke no one could clear away. Alina Carter stood quietly near the digital screen, her tablet still pressed against her chest, though her fingers had begun to ache from holding it so tightly. She wanted to disappear again. Years of working in offices like this had trained her instincts well. Speak carefully. Stay small. Never embarrass powerful people in front of other powerful people. But tonight had crossed a line she could not ignore. Richard Holloway suddenly leaned back in his chair with a forced chuckle, trying to recover control of the room before it slipped away completely. "I think we are all overreacting," he said smoothly. "This is exactly why contracts go through multiple review stages." Nathaniel looked at him without expression. "You presented this agreement as finalized." Richard spread his hands calmly. "And it still can be, once minor language adjustments are made." Alina noticed the way he avoided using the word trap now. That alone told her everything. One of the younger investors finally spoke up from near the end of the table. Was this intentional? The question landed softly, but nobody missed its weight. Richard's jaw tightened slightly before he answered. "Absolutely not." Alina lowered her eyes toward the contract again. The footnote still sat there in tiny legal print beneath subsection 8, buried carefully enough to survive casual review, but dangerous enough to destroy an empire once activated. She had seen clauses like this before during her years in risk analysis. Hidden leverage disguised as routine language. Wealthy people rarely expected betrayal from rooms that smelled like imported leather and $1,200 suits. But greed often wore polished shoes. Nathaniel slowly walked back toward the head of the table. "You said temporary oversight," he said quietly to Richard. "Your lawyers wrote permanent transfer authority." Richard's voice hardened for the first time that evening. "Nathaniel, if you are going to trust an assistant over a room full of executives, perhaps this conversation is already compromised." The insult hung openly in the air now. No humor, no disguise, just class and prejudice sharpened into a blade. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Alina felt the familiar sting behind her ribs, not because she had never heard comments like that before, but because she had. Too many times. The black woman in the room could be helpful, organized, efficient, but the moment she became more competent than expected, suddenly her presence itself became suspicious. Nathaniel remained silent for a long moment. Outside, lightning flashed across the skyline again, illuminating the storm clouds hanging over the city. Then he looked toward Alina. "Did you review the entire acquisition package?" She nodded once. "Yes, sir." "How long did it take you?" "About 45 minutes. Several executives exchanged stunned looks immediately. Richard laughed sharply under his breath. 45 minutes? My legal department spent 3 weeks on this deal." Alina answered calmly. "Your legal department was reviewing compliance structure. I was reviewing exposure patterns." The room went silent again. One attorney slowly removed his glasses, staring down at the contract with visible frustration. Nathaniel's eyes never left Alina now. "What else did you find?" he asked quietly. Alina hesitated. For the first time all night, uncertainty crossed her face. Nathaniel noticed immediately. "Miss Carter." His voice lowered further. "Tell me." Alina slowly stepped closer to the table. The city lights reflected faintly across the glass surface beneath her hands. The debt trigger is only the first problem, she said softly. There is another clause connected to offshore restructuring accounts. Richard Holloway's face lost color instantly, and suddenly everyone in the room understood the nightmare was much bigger than they thought. The temperature inside the boardroom seemed to drop the moment Alina Carter mentioned the offshore accounts. Richard Holloway's confident posture collapsed almost invisibly, like a crack spreading beneath polished marble. Nathaniel Brooks noticed it immediately. Powerful men survived by reading hesitation before words ever arrived. And Richard had just hesitated. The rain outside continued hammering against the glass walls of the skyscraper, while distant thunder rolled over Manhattan like slow drums beneath the night sky. Nobody reached for their phones anymore. Nobody checked emails. The entire room had narrowed down to one thing only. Alina stepped closer to the conference table, her reflection faintly visible across the dark polished surface beneath the overhead lights. The restructuring accounts are connected to Cayman subsidiaries, she said carefully. If the acquisition closes, debt can be shifted offshore before the compliance review triggers. One of the attorneys looked up sharply. That would bypass domestic shareholder protections. Yes, Alina answered quietly. The attorney leaned back slowly, stunned. Richard finally spoke again, though his voice lacked the smooth confidence it carried earlier. These are hypothetical scenarios. No, Alina replied. They are documented pathways. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Nathaniel walked toward the contract once more, loosening his tie slightly for the first time all evening. The movement was small, but everyone noticed it. Men like Nathaniel Brooks rarely looked uncomfortable in public. Yet now frustration shadowed every line in his face. How much? He asked quietly. Richard frowned. Excuse me. Nathaniel's eyes lifted coldly toward him. If this deal went through exactly as written, how much control would I lose? Richard did not answer immediately. That alone became the answer. One investor slowly exhaled under his breath, while another rubbed his forehead in disbelief. Alina looked toward the rain-soaked skyline again for a brief moment. She remembered nights years ago in Chicago sitting beside her mother's hospital bed while spreadsheets glowed across an old laptop balanced on her knees. Numbers had always spoken more honestly to her than people did. Numbers did not care about race, or titles, or who poured coffee during meetings. They only revealed patterns. And tonight, every pattern inside that contract pointed toward disaster. Nathaniel finally stopped pacing and looked directly at Richard Holloway. You attempted to take my company. Richard straightened immediately. That is an outrageous accusation. Is it? Nathaniel's voice remained calm, but now there was steel beneath it. Richard glanced around the room as though searching for support, but the mood had shifted too far. Nobody wanted to stand beside him anymore. Not after the evidence spread openly across the table beneath white conference lights. The lead attorney cleared his throat carefully. Nathaniel, based on the language Miss Carter identified, litigation exposure alone could cripple voting structure within 12 months. 12 months. The words landed heavily. Nathaniel looked down at the unsigned contract again, staring at the place where his signature almost existed, just an inch away from catastrophe. His hand rested against the leather chair beside him while rainwater streaked slowly down the towering windows behind his reflection. Then something unexpected happened. Nathaniel turned toward Alina fully. Not toward legal. Not toward investors. Toward her. Why did you say something? The question caught the room off guard. Alina blinked softly, almost surprised herself. Nathaniel's expression had changed again. The arrogance was no longer leading the conversation now. Something more human had finally broken through it. You could have stayed quiet, he continued. Nobody would have blamed you. Alina lowered her eyes briefly before answering. People like me do not get many chances to choose who we become. Her voice remained soft, but every word settled heavily across the room. I did not want silence to cost innocent employees their jobs. Nobody spoke after that. The city lights shimmered faintly through the storm outside, while the sound of rain filled the empty spaces between breaths. And for the first time all night, Nathaniel Brooks looked at Alina Carter without seeing an assistant standing near the wall. He saw the person who had just saved everything he built. The storm outside began to ease, but inside the boardroom the atmosphere remained impossibly heavy. Rainwater still crawled down the towering glass windows in slow silver trails, while Manhattan flickered below like a restless ocean of light. Nobody had touched the contract in several minutes. It sat open in the center of the conference table beneath the white ceiling lights. Dangerous now not because of what it promised, but because of how close everyone came to believing it. Richard Holloway loosened his collar sharply, the calm mask he wore all evening beginning to crack around the edges. "Nathaniel, this is getting emotional," he said carefully. "Business decisions require perspective." Nathaniel gave a quiet laugh, without humor. "Perspective?" He slowly turned the contract toward the legal team again. "You hid permanent control clauses inside offshore restructuring language." Richard's jaw tightened. "Your assistant is interpreting worst-case scenarios." "No," the lead attorney interrupted softly. Every head turned. The older man removed his glasses and rubbed tired eyes before speaking again. "Miss Carter is not exaggerating. If this agreement had been signed tonight, Brooks Capital would have entered a legally vulnerable position almost immediately." Richard looked stunned that legal had finally abandoned him publicly. Nathaniel stepped closer to the conference table, his reflection stretching faintly across the polished wood beneath the cold lights. "How long?" he asked quietly. The attorney hesitated. "Within 6 to 8 months, voting leverage could have shifted permanently." The room went still again. 6 months. Nathaniel stared down at the signature line near the bottom of the contract, his own pen resting inches away beside it. One signature. That was all it would have taken. Decades of work reduced to leverage in someone else's hands. Outside, the clouds above Manhattan slowly parted just enough for faint moonlight to break through the storm. The silver glow reflected softly across the windows behind Alina Carter as she stood quietly near the wall again, instinctively trying to disappear now that the crisis had passed. But Nathaniel noticed. He noticed everything about her now. The calm posture, the restraint, the fact that she never once used humiliation to gain power over the people who humiliated her first. Richard suddenly stood from his chair. "I think this meeting is over." Nathaniel's eyes lifted slowly toward him. "Oh, it is." Richard grabbed his briefcase quickly, but before he could move farther, Nathaniel spoke again. "Do not contact my board. Do not contact my investors. And do not attempt to revise this agreement." The calmness in his voice made the words land harder than shouting ever could. Richard stared at him for a long second before giving a stiff nod. Then he walked out of the boardroom without another word. The heavy doors closed behind him with a soft mechanical click that echoed through the silence. Nobody moved afterward. One executive slowly exhaled while another leaned back in his chair like a man waking from a nightmare. Nathaniel remained standing at the head of the table, hands resting against the polished wood, eyes lowered briefly. For the first time all evening, he looked tired. Not physically, morally. He finally turned toward Alina. How many people would have lost their jobs? The question came unexpectedly soft. Alina blinked once. Eventually, Nathaniel nodded. She looked down at the contract before answering. Probably hundreds. The room fell quiet again. Nathaniel looked toward the city skyline beyond the windows, his reflection staring back at him through faint streaks of rain. Hundreds of employees, families, retirement accounts, lives tied to a decision he almost made because he trusted status more than substance. Slowly, he picked up the assistant. Badge Alina had set beside her tablet earlier while reviewing the contract. The plastic edges looked small in his hand. Cheap. Forgettable. Yet tonight that badge belonged to the only person in the room who saw the truth clearly. Nathaniel walked toward her carefully, the silence deepening with every step. Then he held the badge out toward her and said something nobody in that room ever expected to hear from a man like him. "I owe you an apology." The silence after Nathaniel Brooks apologized felt almost unreal inside the boardroom. No one shifted in their seats. No one reached for their phones. Even the city beyond the towering windows seemed quieter now, the rain easing into thin silver streaks beneath the midnight glow of Manhattan. Alina Carter looked down at the assistant badge resting in Nathaniel's hand. The plastic corners were worn slightly from months clipped to blazers and office lanyards, passed through security gates by people who rarely remembered her name. Yet tonight that small badge carried more weight than every title sitting around the conference table. Nathaniel lowered his hand slowly. "I judged you before you spoke," he admitted quietly. The honesty in his voice unsettled the room more than anger ever could. Men like Nathaniel were trained to dominate conversations, not confess mistakes inside them. Alina met his eyes for the first time in several long minutes. She could see exhaustion there now. Not weakness. Something deeper. The exhaustion of a man realizing how close pride had brought him to ruin. One executive cleared his throat softly before standing. I think we should postpone all negotiations until a complete audit is performed. Nathaniel nodded without looking away from Alina. Agreed. Chairs shifted around the room as executives slowly gathered their folders and tablets, but nobody rushed toward the exit. The atmosphere had changed too much. Hours earlier, this had been a room full of powerful people dismissing a black assistant standing near the wall. Now every person leaving carried the uncomfortable awareness that she had been the only one truly paying attention. The lead attorney approached Alina carefully. Miss Carter, he said quietly, your analysis was exceptional. Alina gave a small nod. Thank you. The older man hesitated before adding, you probably saved this company tonight. She lowered her eyes briefly. I was trying to save the employees. The attorney looked stunned for half a second before slowly walking away. Nathaniel heard the exchange clearly. So did several others. And somehow those words lingered heavier than everything else said that night. Most people in rooms like this fought to protect wealth, position, influence. Alina had fought for people she would probably never meet. Cleaning staff, receptionists, junior analysts. Families depending on paychecks powerful men treated like numbers inside spreadsheets. The boardroom slowly emptied until only a few dim lamps remained glowing above the conference table. Outside, the storm clouds finally began drifting apart over the city skyline. Nathaniel loosened his tie completely now, the polished image he carried all evening fading into something more human beneath the quiet light. Why did you never tell anyone about your background? He asked softly. Alina slipped the badge gently from his hand. People hear titles before they hear truth. Nathaniel looked away briefly, absorbing the sentence in silence. Somewhere down below, traffic horns echoed faintly through wet Manhattan streets while elevator doors opened and closed beyond the hallway outside the boardroom. Alina gathered her tablet carefully, preparing to leave now that the meeting had finally collapsed under its own deception. But before she reached the door, Nathaniel spoke again. Brooks Capital has an open position in strategic risk management. Alina stopped, but did not turn around immediately. I am aware, she answered quietly. Nathaniel almost smiled for the first time all night. I do not think you belong behind an assistant desk. Slowly, Alina faced him again. The soft silver glow from the city lights reflected across the glass walls behind her, outlining the calm dignity she carried even after everything that happened. With respect, sir, she said gently, I did not need tonight to know my worth. Nathaniel stood completely still after that, because deep down, he understood the truth behind her words immediately. The real tragedy was never that Alina underestimated herself. It was that everyone else did. 1 week later, the storm that nearly destroyed Brooks Capital had become a quiet rumor whispered across executive floors and legal departments throughout Manhattan. Nobody spoke publicly about how close the company came to losing control of its own empire. But inside the glass tower overlooking the city, people moved differently now. More carefully, more aware. The elevators opened onto the 32nd floor just after 7:30 on a cold Monday morning. Employees stepped into the polished hallway carrying coffee cups and laptops while soft jazz drifted quietly through hidden ceiling speakers. Beyond the towering windows, Manhattan glowed beneath pale winter sunlight, reflecting off wet streets left behind by overnight rain. Alina Carter walked through the lobby in a charcoal gray coat, tablet tucked beneath one arm, her footsteps calm against the marble floor. The security guard at the front desk straightened immediately when he saw her. Morning, Miss Carter. The title still sounded unfamiliar. Alina offered a polite smile. Good morning, Daniel. Nearby, 2 junior analysts lowered their voices as she passed. Not because they were mocking her anymore, but because they recognized her now. Word had spread quickly after the deal collapsed. Some called her brilliant. Others called her fearless. But most simply called her the woman who saved Brooks Capital. Alina stepped into the private elevator reserved for senior executives, something she still had not fully adjusted to. The doors closed softly behind her as the city rose around her floor by floor in silence. When the elevator opened again, the 32nd floor looked exactly the same as it had 1 week earlier. Same glass walls, same polished wood, same skyline stretching endlessly beyond the windows. Yet everything felt different. Near the center hallway, mounted beside the Strategic Operations Office, a new nameplate reflected beneath the overhead lights. Alina Carter, Director of Strategic Risk Analysis. She paused for half a second. After seeing it, not because she doubted she belonged there, but because she remembered every moment people insisted she did not. The late nights, the ignored ideas, the polite smiles hiding quiet prejudice behind them, the meetings where her presence mattered only when coffee needed refilling. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Looks better than assistant, does it not? Alina turned. Nathaniel Brooks stood several feet away near the conference room entrance, hands folded loosely in front of him. He looked different this morning. Less polished somehow. More grounded. The sharp arrogance that once filled every room around him had softened into something quieter over the past week.